Cool.
Why on earth are we here?
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another in our Let's Talk Leadership live conversations. The usual gang are here this morning. Patrick calling in from Sweden, Britt from Holland, Tim is calling in from Germany, and Ian and I are still in our bunkers in the UK. But it's lovely to have you join us. If you are joining us live, please ask any questions, challenge our thinking. But this morning we're going to be visiting something we kicked off talking about last time we met, which was triple loop leadership. And we've rather developed our ideas on this since we've been off air. And some of the things we're going to say this morning might be a bit controversial. Some may be things that you completely disagree with. Some maybe you agree with. So do join in and let us have your thoughts and ideas. Patrick, I'm going to sort of hand over to you just to kick us off again, as you kindly volunteered before we came on air. But the idea is that all of us are going to provoke or ask questions to which we may not have the answers, and hope that other people do. So, Patrick, over to you.
Thank you. It's nice to see everybody. We started this conversation in one other session looking at leading out of scarcity into abundance, which is the focus here. And I kind of arrived there through this triple loop leading, learning to lead learning. And so I'm learning myself. And I started confronting some of, as we all do, these ideas about leadership and so on. And some things hit me because I've been involved in a couple of other sessions where I've actually been a participant rather than leading, and around EDI and things. And so I've been confronting in myself some of my own, what I would say, heritage that is very white and very colonial, that I am not really that aware of, but is becoming more and more aware to me. One question that I had about, I come from the Center for Creative Leadership, and we have been talking at different times through our history, our own history of democratizing leadership, right? And I've had a particular problem with that phrase, and I didn't know why. So I want to talk today a little bit about, what do we mean by democratizing leadership? And isn't that potentially just another form of adjective in front of leadership? I want to ask some questions about that. I want to ask some questions about what's the difference between DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion. All of these are building to something that I've been thinking about in terms of what are resources that we actually cultivate as leaders. What is it that we cultivate? And what is it that's missing? What is scarce? And what is it that our own biases create as scarce? And I have some ideas about that, because we speak of leadership, we speak of democratizing leadership, we speak of making leadership available to people, and we don't speak of things like corruption. And I think when I look around, and I look at what we as leaders or leader developers or leadership thinkers, how can we spend 50 years talking about this without addressing the idea of corruption? And now I don't have the answer to that, but I have an approach that I'd like to speak about that has to do with scarcity and abundance. But first, let me give it back to us and say, what do we mean? What comes to mind, and what is good and less good about the idea of democratizing leadership? I turn that back over to you.
So Patrick, I'm going to ask you for your definition of corruption, because when you sent that note through to me, two things hit me immediately, and I don't know why they did, but I felt slightly uncomfortable. One was the word decolonizing leadership, and the other was, or the two words, and the other was corruption. Not because I disagree, but I wanted to be clear the language we're using. So with corruption, for instance.
Okay, if I could, since we're provoking each other, and I have a lot to say about that, and I don't want to launch right now into, if it's okay, but I will, into another 2 or 3 minute thing. I've been speaking now for 3 minutes. I definitely will come back to that. But I think if I heard from others about what democratizing leadership is or is not, it helps me go into why I see corruption and why I see decolonization the way I do.
Right. Okay. Fair point.
Yeah. So, but without me making assumptions, let me turn it back to us and say, and ask us about how you feel, because I do like, by the way, Matthew, when you said decolonization made you uncomfortable, it makes me uncomfortable. And that was my cue. That was my flag. That was my moment of leadership, as some people speak. It was like, when something makes me uncomfortable, there's probably an opportunity for leading there. I don't know what it is. I have to think about it, but there's probably something there. But let's go back to democratizing, because it's not quite as confrontive as decolonization.
Well,
anybody?
Go on. Yeah, I could jump in. I mean, I think it's usually taken to mean pushing leadership development down in an organization to people who don't normally get leadership development in a more formal sense. It's often used to mean that. And I'm wondering if democratization is actually the right word there, because that can sometimes sort of suck people into the trap of thinking it also means a kind of round table, purely consensual, almost Swedish, Patrick, type of traditional leadership, in the sense that everybody's got to be more or less on board with something. So as a principle, okay, I'm not sure it's the best adjective to have there, though, in front of leadership, to be honest.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. My questions are not meant as though they're couched in, I think this is right. So I hope that comes out. Yeah. But I agree. Anything else? Ian, Britt, Matthew. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I just think that, I suppose the thought going through my mind as Tim was speaking was that leadership occurs at any point where a person or a group of people are influential in getting other people to do something, whether that's good or bad. At that moment where others say, yeah, we like what we've heard, we agree with it, or we're going to go along with it because these people seem to know what they're talking about. To me, there is an element of leadership in all of that, in that at some point, someone or a group of people have had a thought, an idea, promoted a point of view, and others have gone along with it. And they've gone along with it either because they agree with it, or because they're worried they're going to get left out if they don't go along with it, or they've been coerced into it through some threat or some suggestion anyway that something untoward might happen if they don't say yes. And you see this in a children's playground where a child will say, come on, why don't we do this? And the rest of the kids say, yeah, good idea. And they all go charging off, chasing each other, whatever that might be. You see it in the boardroom. And to me, the whole idea of this democracy bit, picking up on Tim's thoughts, is that all of us being open to other viewpoints, which may then influence the way we make our decisions or think about the world. And perhaps also this idea about bias, that everyone has inbuilt biases, and being aware of those, not apologizing for them necessarily, but being aware of them and understanding how they play out in our own thinking is also part of this. So it's sort of opening up our minds to other possibilities, but recognizing we may still have to be in a position of making a decision at some point.
Great. I think between the two of you, you're hitting at something that I've struggled with this idea, and that is if we just take the metaphor democracy, it means voice, it means vote, it means that it's not an ability to influence. I have that ability no matter what.
Yeah.
In other words, it's within me. It's something that I have, that I bring. It's a democratic piece. And what I don't see happening in leadership or leadership development is just pushing that down doesn't mean that you give people voice. It doesn't mean that they're actually counted equally across the board. And so that was one of my pieces there, is that it feels like we're pretending that we're giving voice. I mean, real democratic voice, when we may not be. So I agree with what you're saying. We are trying to be open and so on. But if we actually take the term democracy, right, we don't have to try. You've got a voice and it counts. But I think our voices don't count in leading. And that's where I get into this decolonization kind of thing, is that inside of this democracy label, we pretend that we're giving equal voice, but we don't.
Yeah, but I think it's also, you mentioned EDI and DEI and all the various different combinations. If you take diversity, one of the discussions I've been having recently is with people about how diverse are the people that you speak with, how diverse are their views, are the people you speak with, the people you allow into your world that then impact possibly the way you would then make decisions. And I'm not sure, it's starting to be a conversation, but I'm not sure we're anywhere near where we need to be. So that, you as you look at the groups of people we work with, however open they are, however different they are in their views, they tend to take information, they tend to see the world through the eyes of other people like them, or other people in their sphere. And really listening to very alternate voices is often a challenge, not necessarily because they don't want to do it, but they're just not in those sort of networks or ecosystems or areas of work where they would hear those different voices and really understand the impact of it.
Let me flag a word that you use, and I'm being provocative, Matthew. All right. You said allow in. Inside that is a power statement.
Yeah.
And so I think our framing is colonized when we do that, because we're still allowing things to happen. And so one thing that's been confronting me in some of the work that I've been doing is that my language and the way I see things is really, really tight in there. I'm allowing people, I'm empowering others. That whole language is me having something that someone else doesn't have, and me regulating access to that. I am empowering others. I hold it, therefore, and I'm helping others. This is, I think, what you can sense is where I'm going with this idea of corruption, is that when we look at diversity, equity, and inclusion, if we look at bringing in voices, that doesn't mean we make them equitable. If we, and in most of our leading and in most of our programs, we focus on D and I. Equity is lost often because we, as white people, feel good about it. Well, at least we're doing the D and the I part, right? And we don't know how to address the E part. But when I talk with people who are not white, and this is where all of this is coming from, because I had some really wonderful experience where I learned an awful lot about myself, but some very caring people who are not white, where they were bringing forward the simple fact that if you start with equity, diversity and inclusion will follow. And if you start with diversity, equity doesn't necessarily follow. And if you start with diversity and hop over that and go to inclusion, we still haven't gotten there. And that's where I said, that's not very democratic. No, that's not very democratic. That's not democratic. That's not democratizing leadership in that sense. And so what I got to there,
Patrick.
Yeah,
I think it's really important to define equity here and the difference with equitable and other similar words. But sorry to jump in, but I think this is a crucial moment.
Go ahead. Go.
So are we defining equity as creating conditions where people can fulfill their potential, or are we defining it as something more like a level playing field, or trying to equalize organizations or society? That's really the spectrum of, if you like, the playing field that we're in there. And, my own take would be more the first thing that I said, which is allowing people to fulfill the potential, also the potential that they want to fulfill as well. It's a long, long way from equitable in the full sense of the word.
I heard the word allow again.
Yes, you did. Yeah, good call.
Patrick, I'm gonna push back on this. I put in my note to you. You know, in all societies, whether we like it or not, wherever you are in the world, even on the most remotest of islands in the Pacific Ocean, there are dominant and non-dominant groups.
Absolutely.
And they may be dominant groups because historically they've been the largest group of a certain type of people that happen to exist in that environment. It may be that through all sorts of things, religious background, military background, power, access to resources, they become a dominant community. And whether that's good or not, it is natural that they will see the world through their eyes.
Yeah.
That's the focus, that's the lens that they use to make sense of the world around them. And the non-dominant will be looking at the same world, but through very different eyes. And they will see a lot of things going on that to them, quite rightly, are not equitable, are not fair, are not giving them the opportunities. And that exists wherever you are in the world, you know, at whatever level you look at. I can quote all sorts of geographical arguments for, you know, people who had water resources, whatever.
You don't have to demonstrate it. I agree 100% that dominance and dominance exists.
Yeah. So I see this as something around encouraging dominant communities to really open up to understanding what it's like to be a non-dominant in their community. So whether it's in a local neighborhood and understanding why maybe someone with an Asian background living in a background of mainly white, British, North Yorkshire people or whatever it might be, you know, how they see that world from their perspective. What it's like if you're the only person who has suffered some awful experience during your earlier life, like, for instance, at the moment, Ukrainian children coming into Western Europe and suddenly seeing that, you know, people are looking after them, being kind to them, sharing, doing all the right things, but they're still the non-dominant community that they're entering. Do they have equity? And I think we need to be encouraging, when we do our work, all of us, to think about trying to understand what it's like to be that other group or those other groups. So that
would be empathy.
Yeah, but it needs to be more than just empathy. I think you then need to work to create opportunities so that those non-dominant groups genuinely feel they have a voice in what is going on. And that voice is not just, oh, we ought to allow them to speak. That voice is this group is just as important as the dominant group. We need to listen carefully.
So if I lift that over to what Tim said, in terms of a definition of equity, we're talking about between dominant and subordinate, right? Because you don't need to convince me on the. I mean, I'm already there. Absolutely, I'm part of a dominant group. I have been all my life, and I can name a dozen different dominant groups I'm part of. You know, depending on who I'm speaking with. But if we're looking at equity, it goes beyond the empathy, is what you're saying. Is that just understanding them? And what we need to do, in part, is getting the dominant group to be empathetic in some way. And I'm pushing us a little bit further than that, because, you know, that's one of the core competencies of any leadership development program that we have, and it doesn't work.
Yeah.
And so I hear you, and I feel I'm pretty empathetic, but it doesn't get me to equity. And so I'm trying to provoke us a little bit, and I'll talk about corruption in a second, to reframe this a little, because you were talking about giving opportunity. You used the word give. But you were talking about opportunity that I grab onto. But I'm also aware that Britt isn't saying anything and Ian isn't saying anything. And I just want to do a check around to make sure we're not just having a sway here.
Thanks, Patrick. And forgive me, I have builders doing work downstairs and it's incredibly loud. So I'm on mute for most of the time. We're having just a moment of quiet. Thank you for the conversation, Patrick and Matthew and Tim so far. And I'm sure Britt and I have got some thoughts on these things, but I'm you know, with power and dominance comes great responsibility. And but I was really intrigued. It's funny how words are triggering reactions in us. When you were talking, Patrick, just now about I was empowering others. I have a problem with that because I fundamentally believe that empowerment is intrinsic. It's something that one does for oneself, and that we can create conditions where others can empower themselves. But it's funny how little words trigger beliefs and values in ourselves. I think I understood what you were saying, but the whole thing about are we giving control to people? Are we letting go of control for others to take control? Are we allowing people to, with principles and some guidelines to make sure as social groups we can still do the right thing? But of course, it's dangerous. I guess this is the connection to corruption, because the minute you start to let go of some of these system controls, all sorts of chaos can ensue, particularly if people without that practice of being dominant have become dominant all of a sudden. All sorts of things can happen. Right, but no, I'm just this is just triggering my mind with all sorts of things, Patrick. So thank you.
Well, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. Britt?
I've got lots of as the non-dominant member of this male group. I do have lots of thoughts and lots of words, but it's also fascinating to just hear you and see you challenge each other. I think that if you talk about allowing and yielding. In a way, yielding power, because that's what that's about. What you sometimes see when leaders start to yield their power, they have enormous difficulty doing so, and they frame it sometimes in a way where they say to the non-dominant group, let me tell you guys what you need. So there is a certain arrogance, if I may say, there as well, and a certain sort of, I'm not used to giving away my power, so I will now. But while I do that, let me tell you where I think you should go with that allowance. And so I think if we talk about true EDI, you have to make sure somehow, and I don't know how, but you have to make sure that people don't just play lip service to the, oh yes, let's listen to the non-dominant group, whoever they are, but to actually put procedures and systems in place that allow the non-dominant group to actually really do something with it. So almost to force the dominant ones to become the non-dominant, and of course then it becomes a sinusoid movement, because at some point they want their power back. When I said I'll empower you, I didn't mean that you should take my job, So there's fear and there's lots of things as well involved. Yeah.
So I'm really influenced by Chomsky, Lakoff and Johnson, who look at language from the metaphorical perspective. And so the way we're speaking about all of these things, control and power, we're speaking of them as though they were in a bucket somewhere. We're speaking of them as though they are outside. We're speaking of them as a resource. We're speaking of them as a limited resource. There's only so much to go around. And if you add to that a series of other kinds of things, we get first of all, if we see them and own them as resources, if we reframe our thinking that they are resources rather than competencies, rather than rights, rather than values, if they're resources, there's something we can cultivate. Which brings me to corruption, and it brings me to the way we're using our language, the way I use my language. So this is not a lecture about you all. It's a lot of self-reflection, and I appreciate it. But when I look at these things as resources, I'm trained as an economist in the background. I look at them differently than I do when I look at them as rights or I look at them as values. Because if we take a value approach to leadership, we try to identify the core values and we try to homogenize some kind of value statement, which we know in a global context is kind of futile. We don't necessarily want to have homogenized values, but we want to homogenize that for our leadership, thereby making those who don't share those values out of access to leadership. We make it scarce through a rationale of values. And I say it's not conscious, it's not intended, but it's an outcome, in my opinion. And when we recognize that maybe there are a set of things that we call values or rights that actually, if we look at them as resources, in fact, unlimited resources, it might change our thinking about them. And I'll give you an example. Let's take human dignity. We look at human dignity as a right. It's a human right. I believe it is. At the same time, we have dominant and subjugated groups. And one of the elements there is that the dominant group will define and make scarce the dignity of the subjugated group, just as if it was a resource. So by adopting my values, you subjugated group, by adopting my values, you get dignity. You get to be a leader. If you don't adopt my values, because I'm casing it in a value context, you don't have as much dignity or status or power or influence or voice or even human security if you don't do that. However, if I were to flip this around, so let me say this, therefore, I am being corrupt. There is a resource called human dignity that I am regulating artificially access to, which is the definition of a corruption there. It's a colonization. I'm taking a resource that is, in this case, it's inexhaustible. How can you have too much human dignity, right? How can you even take it away? We do. That's artificial. We artificially take it away. So my thinking is, corruption is this. It's the making artificially scarce of resources that others need. We need dignity. I make artificially scarce a resource. Artificial makes it corrupt. And then the closing piece of corruption is I extort value, or I extort something from you in order to give you the dignity. In this case, I would extort your values. In this case, I would say, if you adopt my white man values, we can play together. I say this to you, Britt. If you adopt my male values, if you behave more like a man, you will behave more like a leader in my organization, and I will extort from you your female dignity for that.
Mm-hmm. So that goes back to the arrogance, huh?
Yes, absolutely.
That goes back to the underlying thought that we are dominant, therefore we're actually a little bit better than you, or the other way around, we're a little bit better than you, and therefore we should be dominant.
And
we're
I don't know
dominance.
And I don't know how to crack that without reframing it. In other words, if I get into that, I first run into in myself denial. I don't think I'm arrogant, Britt. I'm biased about this. I don't think I've been raised this way to believe this is what leadership is. I'm playing with you now, by the way.
Sure.
I don't hear it. I am not racist, right? I am not sexist. I am not that way. And we end up in that we go there, and then we'll stay there forever, you and me.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to present an idea is if we took it out of the rights and the values perspective and put it in a resource perspective, then I would want to cultivate that.
Yeah.
I would want, because the more I cultivate voice, the more and cultivate is a word that you do with resources, right? The more I cultivate voice, the more I cultivate dignity. The more I cultivate emotional skill, critical thinking, the more I cultivate these resources, the better it will be for the collective. That's the leap of logic I'm making.
Okay, so Patrick, let me make a suggestion that just going through my head. If we start off then, taking the point you just made, if we start off by saying, I am sexist, I am biased, I am capable of misogyny, I am capable of thinking that my view of how things should be done is better than someone else's. I am all of those things. And therefore, if you like, turning what you've said into, I need to recognize that I'm all of these things, not just have other people tell me it, or be polite and not tell me, which is even worse. I need to recognize that I have the potential for all of this. You know, I have the potential for being really unpleasant. I have the potential for thinking unpleasant things about other people. I have the potential for being devious, mischievous, two-faced, all of the things. Therefore, whenever I'm doing that, I am actually using my dominant position to deny other people an opportunity.
Yes.
Therefore, the starting point has to be a clear recognition that not that I'm going to stop doing those things because we're all human, but I need to recognize when I am doing them and have some mechanism for knowing that through the eyes of people who are being impacted negatively by all of that sort of thought and behavior. So in other words, it's not just empathy, it's going beyond, it's not just understanding how Brit might feel being told that as a woman she needs to man up, as an example, you know, but it's going deeper than that and saying it's not just how Brit feels. I need to really understand that what I'm doing is denying someone else an opportunity. Really,
you're making something scarce.
Yes, that all of these biases, you know, my white middle class educated background, while it has lots of positive benefits to me, does actually encourage me to think in certain ways which might, at the very moment I think like that, deny other people the equitable opportunities and maybe to recognize that just because they haven't done what I've done doesn't mean to say that their life and the where they've got to at that point when I'm meeting them or working with them isn't equally valid and important and useful.
And I absolutely, it requires that requires a personal transformation of a white man like myself.
Yeah.
On so many levels.
Yes.
My frustration is that conversation about human potential and personal transformation has been going on for 50 years.
Yeah.
And I haven't felt it nudge much in the grand scheme of things. So my challenge to us is a both and challenge, Matthew. It's not a you're wrong. It's a I haven't seen it kick in, right? I haven't seen it work at this pace that we need to make it work. That's why I'm challenging the framing, is that we continue to frame them. And what I heard you, let me say what I heard. I would have to recognize that I am denying somebody else of something. And let me give you an example of someone who was in a similar experience to me, that where one was being confronted with the privilege that comes with whiteness. This person grew up in the coal mines of Virginia, and became something much more than a coal miner's son in the sense of wealth and prestige and power. And he was rejecting the idea that he had advantage. He was saying very clearly that oh, I did it myself, man. You know, this is, you know, you can't, you know, my grandfather and my dad died of lung disease. I didn't because the economy went to hell, or I would have been there, for example. And so there's kind of a transformation that this person probably never, I can't reach them on what I just told you because the understanding is so far away, and they have a point. In other words, it's not that they're wrong; they have a point. They just didn't. I think it was King who said something like, you know, the white man tells the black man to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, but doesn't recognize that the black man doesn't have any boots on. And there's a difference there. And so what I am embracing in what you say is that there's a personal transformation to happen. And what I am questioning is that we then end up in the human potential movement, and we end up in a language of vertical development, and we end up in a language of higher consciousness, and we end up in a language that is very complicated and even more colonial if you speak to people of color, because they're saying, I'm not really interested in higher conscious stuff. I've got stuff right in front of me like power that, you're not addressing in the higher consciousness discussion. You're not, I am not addressing in that discussion the things that are really hitting me and holding me back. I don't have any damn shoes on, even when I have shoes on. So what I'm struggling with is I embrace what you say, but it takes me to higher consciousness. And what the troubling piece for me is that in nature, abundance happens without any gray matter. There's no higher consciousness among bees and among birds who clean the nostrils of rhinoceroses. Abundance without human intervention happens, like we say leadership happens. It happens. And I'm saying we may be making things more complex because we've been given this extra gray matter and don't quite know what to do with it. So we become mischievous. When some of the basic principles of leading into abundance have to do with monitoring, as you were saying, scarcity, but not from a higher consciousness level. It means by putting it front and center. Now I have to recognize my bias. I may or may not get there. I do, and I believe all that. I think it's a both and. My long harangue is about why can it happen in nature? Why can abundance happen in nature without humans? And humans, in my definition of corruption, create artificial scarcity of key resources, dignity, voice, education. One second. How can it happen in nature and we get in the way of it? Britt, please. That's it.
Well, just to challenge you, in the same way that abundance happens in nature without human intervention, so does dominance. Nature is a cruel, and cruel is our own label that we put on it, obviously. But nature is no kind place for many species.
Yes.
And there are species who will create scarcity for whatever reason, just for survival. Maybe it's just biology that means that we are programmed to be incapable of creating abundance without looking after our own sense of power and greed.
Give me an example. I hear you. I haven't found one, and I've spent a long time looking. So it's a loaded question, Britt. Okay. Give me an example of a species that will kill itself through non-intervened externally, has killed itself by upsetting the ecosystem in such a way that they cut off their own food source. I haven't found an example, but you just asserted that they will. Now, does dominance exist? Yes, it does. And that's why we probably have hierarchy. In other words, there is something that happens there, and I'm not purporting that it's the right thing to do. I'm not purporting that we set up a Darwinian example of, what's supposed to work. Mm-hmm. What I'm suggesting is, without human intervention, without the intervention of a meteor or a earthquake or something like that, I haven't found a species that has undermined itself.
You mean to the detriment of the whole species? You meant, or just a small group of them? Because I'm not sure that was what you meant, Britt. Was it? Because there are many animals in nature that either kill each other or kill other species. Yeah. Is that? I think that's, Britt, what you were meaning, wasn't it? It's a brutal.
That's what I thought. Yeah, it's inter versus intra. I think is also what we're talking about here. Yeah.
True. Thank you.
But what I heard behind that was because there is brutality there, and so I'm not arguing that we should do that. What I'm arguing is a little bit different there, and that is that I haven't found, even in that brutality, something that didn't hold the system together. In other words, I haven't found an instance where a species has undermined itself or other species completely. what do we say in Swedish? Made them extinct. I haven't found we do that. Sorry, with the exception of us. But even our nearest neighbors, right? Even our chimpanzees don't do it.
Can I ask? Yeah. Can I come in? So I'm loving the conversation. My brain is hurting now, just trying to figure this out. I can't imagine what it's like to be you, Patrick, about empathy, because your head, if it's exploring these things every day, I don't have room for that in my head, but I love it. Thank you for bringing the conversation. If we were all to take a special cocktail this evening, and it is Friday after all, we have a cocktail, and then tomorrow that cocktail allows us to see the world through very different eyes. So scarcity is no more, abundance is everywhere, and our leadership skills, values, principles, whatever. I know some of these terms may not be too appropriate in this abundance view of the world, but how would we be? What would we do? How would we, change the world for the better if we all were able to adopt that type of, I'm using terms like mindset or thinking patterns, whatever it is, how we would describe it? What would the outcome be? Because that would be fun to explore, wouldn't it? If there was no restriction on love, on trust, on respect, on dignity and knowledge and development and all that kind of cool stuff.
I heard two questions there. What would the outcome be? I'm not sure. I'm asserting the outcome would be better. I'm not sure.
So. Yeah. What would the behaviors be like? What would we be doing?
I have a thought about that, but I mean, I've been talking a lot. If you want me to, I will say it.
Does anybody else have a view on that? Because on one hand, I think, wouldn't it be beautiful? And I'm thinking also, I just can't even get my head around it. Could it be quite scary? Because we talk a lot about polarities, paradox, tensions, both and situations. We would be shifting a lot of those to an opposing pole, wouldn't we? Just to bring that to life.
But and it links back to something Britt said earlier. I mean, I'm getting a bit uncomfortable with all of this because we are denying human nature by going down this route. Because as soon as everything becomes as a group wants it to be for the better, another group will be saying, "I don't want that. I want something else." And I'm either going to, and what you're wanting is stopping me from getting what I want. And therefore, I'm somehow going to get into some way of denying you the abundance, because that abundance isn't how I see things.
Can I interject right there?
Yeah.
You're saying that one group is going to make something scarce for the other.
No, I'm not. I'm saying that one group, by creating an abundance of whatever it is that we collectively agree, having drunk this cocktail in an evening, there is always going to be another group that says, "I don't see the world like that, and your abundance is not my abundance. I want to create abundance in a different way."
The cocktail will become the problem, right, Matthew? Because it will be a finite resource of cocktail, if you like, because that would take a lot of education or system changes and things to
exactly. So the way what struck me was that at Let's Talk Leadership, we are now coaching a lot of young people in Africa. And when you listen to some of the things they're dealing with, a lot of it is to do with violence towards women and young girls in some form or other. And I sat there listening to this saying, gosh, what wonderful work, what an awful situation to be in. How do you do it with limited resources? And then the penny dropped. We actually have violence to young women and girls in the United Kingdom. Mm-hmm. It's just hidden or more sophisticatedly hidden. And, it's something that's not spoken about. So there is something where you could say that you can work this both ways. There is an abundance of violence towards women and young girls, regardless of where you are in the world, regardless of where you live, what you do, what your background is. You can see it in societies which are very generous and very, using my term, very developed in their educational systems and in their healthcare. You can see it in the poorest of societies anywhere in the world. The same issue exists. There is an abundance of abuse towards women and young girls.
What would be the scarcity question behind that?
The scarcity question behind it is, how do we make scarce the people who actually think that it is right and proper to be abusive to women and young girls. Okay. Wherever they are, whatever their color, whatever their religion, how do we make that scarce?
Right. That's part of what I'm suggesting is that if you take it one level down, what are these women not getting? What is scarce for them?
What is scarce for them often, apart from their own dignity, is access to the resources, both physical, financial, and human, which would give them a voice, and a voice that would be listened to by people who could help and support them and do something about making that behavior scarce.
That takes me to Ian's first part of his question, is by focusing on the abundance of violence, we then have to make it scarce. We start leading through another scarcity paradigm. However, if we focus on the scarcity of dignity, the scarcity of voice that these people have, I'm no longer leading through this, I focus on making abundant the voice, abundant the dignity. I shift my leadership language from how do I make scarce these people to how do I make abundant these humanitarian resources? Because voice really shouldn't be anything but abundant. Dignity really shouldn't be anything but abundant. If I focus on making dignity abundant, the other people disappear. And if I focus our leadership language on making those things abundant, I am not threatening someone else. What I see happening in the United States is two people threatening the actual existential elements of two groups. They're threatening each other with scarcity rather than figuring out how do we develop, what are the things that we need to make abundant. It used to kind of happen. But so it was more, so I'm back to Ian's question is that what would every day look like? Well, if human nature is divisive, which is what you said, Matthew, my abundance will not be agreed to by somebody else's abundance. Is there anything that we share? Is there any resource that we share that if we made it abundant, we both win? And I think dignity is one of them. I think voice is one of them. I think education is one of them. I think security, physical, emotional, economic security is there. I think that there are probably a list of 10 to 20 things that if we focus on abundance, such that if Britt says to me, you know what, I am not being heard. And we as a group hold me, Patrick, responsible for that, right? It's like, okay, how do we address that? We're not telling Pat to straighten out. We're not telling Patrick he's wrong. We're not telling Tim Hill that he's just a dominant man in a group. We're saying, wait a minute. So my question is, could we ask ourselves daily in every meeting, if we take action A, what are we making scarce? And bring other people into that conversation. If I say we're going to lead this way because I believe in it, we need to have a circuit around that says, okay, in so doing, what am I inadvertently making scarce? And that's where diversity comes in, is that I don't see it. But the question, Ian, is how do we ask ourselves with every act we take, what are we making scarce? Because if we're making of these 10 things if we're making any of those things scarce, we have to rethink for anybody. So if I buy a telephone, what am I making scarce in buying a telephone? I'm making the life dignity scarce of a young black boy in Central Africa for digging up materials for the battery. I'm making his experience scarce. I should be aware of that. And I should be thinking, Is that the way? Is that what I want to do? I'm making myself abundant here. I got a telephone. That's cool. But what am I making scarce when I do that? So that's the thinking, Matthew. That's the thinking, is that I agree with all the things you say about human nature. And I'm saying in the non-human nature, right? That seems to happen automatically because I still am waiting for that example of that species that has undermined itself, that species that has made another species extinct through its life, through its living in an ecosystem. And I think that our gray matter should lift up the question, what are we making scarce? It's not more complicated than that.
You've just triggered another reaction to me now, Patrick, around, I was discussing with some leaders yesterday around the idea of circularity. And it's a huge sustainability ambition in many organizations who fundamentally, of course, have a significant carbon footprint that they need to address. And net zero gets talked about a lot, and what does it really mean? But going back to your phone example, if to maintain that ability to have technology like that means we have to recycle 90-something% of your old phone for your new phone to prevent people from having to deal with the scarcity. We have to look at abundance in a scarce way. If that's not a complete contradiction in terms, we have to be mindful that abundance doesn't mean abundance of everything. It means those resources that are actually abundant, that we're not artificially, I think was your term, artificially making scarce. But those scarce resources, we must also respect and not have an abundant attitude to those, because otherwise we get trapped in this cycle.
And if we're talking with, exactly, Ian, if we're talking with business leaders, we have to remember that the whole economic system, the whole market system, is based on scarcity. Scarcity, by definition, is going to put prices up because it's limited or less supply, which to a very large extent is what you want in a kind of capitalist system. If we call it capitalism or not, doesn't have to be. Let's just say market-based system. And if we're trying to, on our mission, working with the private sector as well as the public sector, I think the point is very much that we've got to address that. Some people might say, but scarcity is good. It captures the Darwinian spirit of humankind or something like that.
And that's why I'm putting it on there. I agree that fundamentally, that is our basic ontological approach. We lead through scarcity. We organize our markets through scarcity. We organize our leadership through scarcity. We live and teach through scarcity. I have something that you need, and I tell you you need it, and then I extort value from it. Now, how can we have a market, for lack of a better word? How can we have an exchange? How can we have an exchange space, right? That actually keeps incentives for people to produce. And minimize scarcity. And I think the way to do that is to put it on the table. That's what I'm saying, is that we shift the conversation from rights, we shift the conversation from values, and we take it directly to the conversation of, when I do this in this meeting, which I did in the beginning, I'm not hearing from Britt. My behavior is making one person's input here scarce, I think. Maybe Britt is thinking. Maybe it's not scarce, but I have an obligation to check because it's scarce. And once I take on this scarcity thinking, what is scarce? What am I doing that's scarce? It just kind of opens me up, in terms of, oh, wait a minute, that's not so hard to do. As a principle, because we say we lead through practices, and I'm saying, what if we were to introduce the ontology, the mindset that dignity, voice, all of these, there's about 10, are resources. Our role as leaders is to make them abundant. And the way we do that is we ask every single day, what are we making scarce? Right? I mean, then it doesn't become higher consciousness. It becomes practice oriented. It becomes something that we can teach.
So my question there would be, what does this mean for the curriculum, whether it's a school curriculum, whether it's a business school, whether it's more ad hoc work that we might do, which we sometimes call interventions? I mean, again, back to Ian's point, what does it look like? What does it sound like? But also from the practitioner's point of view. And I'm not sure I have an answer, by the way.
I am now at the edge of my screen. I'm as far as I've gotten. I got to the point where I think we can ask some questions and develop some practices that put scarcity on the table. And I think it falls in the ESG bucket, in that we need to be thinking about, wait a minute, we shouldn't lead through scarcity. Even though our IP systems even though the entire society is geared around that, we shouldn't port that over to human dignity, to voice, to all of these other resources. And if we start there, it might have an impact. But to be honest with you, Tim, you remember where this was 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago. It's a little further now. But I think it'd be great to figure out what are the practices of leading towards abundance and out of corruption. I didn't say that as a title because that makes people very defensive, just like decolonization does. Yeah. But how do we lead out of corruption? Because I think we're corrupting each other. If I make scarce other people's ability to talk in this meeting, I'm being corrupt.
Then I think there is a starting point, perhaps, and I think the starting point is when we're in a group of people and a behavior exists that we feel may have made scarce someone else's ability to contribute, then we ask the question, what are we making scarce at this moment at this specific point in time? What have we made scarce? Not so much what abundance can we create. I think we start with the things that we're doing that in any way, taking your 10, 12 sort of things, make those things scarce. So I think I mentioned last time, I have a colleague who's a friend who's a world leader in a particular industry. He is recognized as a global expert. He has never, ever patented any idea or research or invention he's come up with. And he and I were having a conversation the other day, and he said, Matthew, it's pointless. I've never done that because my task in my life is to put out all of my knowledge, all of my experience to the world and allow the world to use that to make things better.
It's a beautiful example.
Exactly. And if I spent my life chasing patents and protecting patents, I would never come up with the next idea, the next invention, the next creative thought. My life is too short. Tim Berners-Lee would be another example who purposely made the World Wide Web open to everyone. So that's creating an abundance.
Absolutely. Yes.
And therefore, perhaps we start by saying, what are the behaviors that we all exhibit, regardless of creed, race, background, privilege, non-privilege, that makes things scarce for our fellow human beings, the people around us, the people we are with? What are we doing that puts scarcity on the top of their agenda? And we may have done it inadvertently, but we've done it. So what is
it? That's where I'm at. It's inadvertent. It's not always. No. But competitive advantage in Porter's terms, if you follow the people who actually drive that around, is built on scarcity. You protect, you build, competitive advantage is based on the principle of scarcity. And it is so in our consciousness. I was going to say DNA, but I don't believe it. It's in our consciousness because of our colonization that it's okay to run a world through the idea of establishing competitive advantage through the principle of scarcity. And you have an example, and we have the internet, and we have loads of other examples where pay forward and abundance have actually been the global changers. They've been the disruptors of everything. And they're seen as what? The unicorns? Give me a break. It's just because your friend said from the beginning, that's not who I am. I'm not going to lead through scarcity. And that's why I said it's an ontology. It's a mindset. It's not vertical development. He probably thought that way when he was 10 years old.
Yeah.
Mm.
And if we think we can get there through, and this is, one avenue is to work with developing human potential and leader potential and leadership awareness, individual awareness, higher consciousness, spiral development. That's one avenue. I'm not suggesting we stop. I'm just trying to introduce a parallel activity that I think is actually at the base of why we're having the other conversation. Doesn't mean the other one's wrong, but I think it's at the base of it. So anyway, I get pretty impassioned about this. This has gone further.
So can I summarize what I think I've heard today then, Patrick?
Yeah, because we're on.
I don't know what was said.
And forgive me. So is abundance the new scarcity?
Nice.
Or the old scarcity? I don't know.
What I like about that is what I'm saying. Actually, when you start digging around abundance in economic literature, this is not newfangled stuff. This is stuff that was tossed out with, guess what? Business schools and leadership development theory. We made scarce abundance. We sitting here, we colonized people, took it and made it scarce. So yes, what's scarce? I don't know how to do that in a way that doesn't just, but Ian,
maybe that's our challenge before the next time we get together, because I don't think this topic's going to go away. Well, certainly hope it doesn't. But maybe our challenge is, and to anybody that's listening, that we haven't bored to death so far because we've got no answers. But go figure. Go look at the things. I think the call to action from you, Patrick, was go look at things that we're making scarce and stop doing that. Just stop doing it. See what happens.
Yeah. Yes. I just quickly opened a summary of Adam Grant's give and take here, because I'm wondering if we could perhaps another time use some of the ideas in there as a springboard to get more practical as well.
I was thinking the same thing, Tim. It's great work. Yeah.
Because that talks straight to business people as well. Not that this is only about business people. I'm not saying that, but a lot of us have spent considerable amounts of time with business people. And I'm just thinking again, the next thing, as we said, as Patrick said, we're getting to the edge of the screen here a little bit, or the edge of the radar, or whatever we're saying. I think some sort of what would it look like, what would it sound like in daily life? Absolutely. But generally also in business, also in things where perhaps there has been a dominant group, and maybe that's white men, absolutely, who've traditionally dominated there. But what changes can we make?
The principle of reciprocity is deep inside here. So the image of a rhinoceros with a bird on its nose, the interdependence, these things are core. And we've been talking about them forever. That's my frustration is that it's not working. And that's why I keep thinking is if we had a question, Matthew and Ian, if we had something, what are we making scarce? It's like, maybe that's a practice. And if we see where that goes, maybe that's a way to go rather than, a long blown out theory like I've just sort of done.
Well, I'll tell you what I'm going to commit to then. In 10 days' time, I shall be in Madrid with a group of business people I know and like, working for a lovely company. And I'm going to ask that question every time we have a conversation. What are we making scarce at this moment in time? What are we making scarce? And I'll feed back the response I get, or how it's taken on board. Because they're an organization involved in renewable energy. They're an organization with very, very powerful commitments to zero carbon in all of their processes. And so I'll just commit to asking that question and seeing what comes up in the conversation. What are we making scarce by behaving as we're behaving now? Or how does that comment that I've just made create scarcity rather than abundance? So it might be I've said something that rather implies that my idea is the best idea, and I've completely stifled any sort of conversational challenge in the room. At that moment in time, I have created a scarcity of different viewpoints and different thoughts and different ideas because of the way I've behaved.
That's exactly where I'm coming from. Is that I do that now.
Yeah. Let's just try it and see where we get to. Anyway, I'm conscious that the hour is up. In fact, we've gone over the hour, which as you say, Patrick, have bored the pants off anyone listening, or actually might have given them all sorts of ideas, which hopefully we'll hear from. But thanks for joining in today. And if I can just say, as a sort of plug for Let's Talk Leadership and for the work that Britt and Ian and I are trying to do, hopefully we are making more abundant, certainly in parts of the world where it isn't, the opportunity for young people to get access to leadership coaching and leadership ideas.
And I think you are, absolutely. And I think you're starting with that question, you're starting with that philosophy. It is, and unfortunately, I think it's scarce.
Yes. Yeah, it is. But, you know, there are now over 30 young people all over the world getting the benefit of our colleagues helping, supporting them. And we've got about another 30 all queuing up, champing at the bit to wanting to get support. So the more we can do, hopefully in our own small way, we're making abundant something that at the moment is quite scarce.
And what seems to be abundant, Matthew, is our colleagues who are willing to help and do that.
Absolutely. You know, young people.
Shout out to all the people helping us with that, because it's phenomenal.
Yeah, young people are queuing up, but also our professional colleagues are queuing up as well. Anyway, it's lovely to see you all. Have a great weekend. Enjoy whatever you're going to be doing. And I look forward to the next time. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, everybody.
So long.